Thank you very much. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here at Metropolis. I attended the very first Metropolis conference, and MPI hosted, I think, the fifth one about 15 years ago, and it's very exciting to see how much this institution has grown and how important it has become to the international migration community, broadly speaking. So thanks very much to the Metropolis Steering Committee and the organizers for inviting me. Thanks to the Government of Canada for the steadfast support they've provided to Metropolis, and to the Algonquin Nation for welcoming me and us to its land. So far we've heard three different perspectives on the global compacts. One from an international organization that is sort of first among equals in the UN system when it comes to assisting member states to implement the Global Compact for Migration and to cope with migration generally, IOM. We've heard a religious perspective which highlights our common humanity and the equal dignity and worth of every individual in God's eyes. And we've heard a scholarly perspective, which is far from theoretical, but draws from a career's worth of observation of how things actually work in public policy, almost never as exactly planned. The global compacts emerged from all these perspectives, but most of all from the perspectives of states. Perspectives which saw a rare alignment in the middle of this decade, born out of a widespread sense of crisis. Many people question the use of the word crisis to describe the events of 2014 to 2016 loosely, on the southern border of the United States, in the Bay of Bengal region, in the Middle East, and perhaps most consequentially for our discussions here, in the Mediterranean Sea. And I say most consequentially, not because of the human impact, but because until major wealthy donor receiving countries felt the impact themselves of migration crises on a very large scale, this alignment of state perspectives had not happened. I think there was, in 2015 particularly, a realization across the globe that migration cannot be managed by states unilaterally or even in sort of small groups regionally. And this started the process that led to the global compacts. And I think the use of the word crisis is appropriate. It has been a crisis for the people involved who are not able to make safe, orderly, regular journeys. And it's a crisis for many states receiving migrants, particularly those whose politicians are eager to use migrants as a wedge issue to divide and frighten people. The global compacts result from an intentional, cooperative international effort to better deal with what Professor Triandafilidou has called a mess. Quite rightly, a mess. Anything that involves 258 million people can be pretty much relied upon to be a mess in a policy sense. The refugee compact is very much focused on burden sharing among countries, particularly with the host countries of refugees, overwhelmingly in low and middle income countries who have been left to host refugees with very inadequate assistance from the international community, despite the best efforts of organizations like UNHCR. The Migration Compact, with its 23 objectives, focuses around 3 major goals, and I think we've touched upon them here, but in my mind, I sort of group its objectives into 3 categories: reducing the negative factors that compel people to leave their homes, amplifying the benefits of migration for migrants, as well as for their countries of origin and the countries that receive them, and thirdly, bringing order to international migration processes. You can think of the process that led to the global compacts as a drama in 5 acts, very similar to the dramatic arc of classical drama, for those of you who were forced to study the Greek and Roman classics, particularly the Greek classics. What we know of them, it started with an exposition, Act 1, an exposition. And Michelle talked about that period of exposition of large-scale movements, a lot more policy attention, lots of international conferences and processes and reports and so on. There's quite a long sort of period leading up to the second act, the rising action, which really sped up after 2000 with more and more global movements commanding attention of policymakers, until reaching Act 3, the climax, which I would identify as the year 2015, with this confluence of events, particularly in the Mediterranean, which led to Act 4, the falling action, the convening of a special session of the General Assembly at the UN, the adoption by acclaim of the New York Declaration, which set in motion international, the processes for these 2 international compacts, on refugees and for migration. 2 very different processes set in motion there, with the Refugee Compact very firmly in the hands of UNHCR, consulting with states, but really taking the pen to write the Global Compact, not trying to make any breakthroughs in international refugee law. In fact, trying very hard to stay away from any changes in international refugee law for fear that change would mean deterioration. So the focus there was very much on burden sharing, on making the existing system work better, primarily through assistance to host countries and greater agency for refugees themselves. A very different process from the Migration Compact, which was firmly in the hands of states. The first ever negotiated outcome on migration in the United Nations. Never before had there been a line-by-line agreed text on migration. There have been many, as I said, reports, conferences, and so on, but this was a negotiated document. Act 5, the denouement, is still unfolding, and we will see how it unfolds from the adoption of the Global Compact in Marrakesh. A unanimous adoption by acclaim by the 164 countries that attended the Marrakesh conference, but several countries chose not to, either because there was ongoing disagreement within their governments or because they didn't wish to dignify the Marrakesh conference with their presence, perhaps. The vote that took place a week later in the General Assembly was 152 in favor and 5 against the Global Compact. That's a ringing endorsement by anyone's estimation, but nonetheless, the imperfection remains that this was not a unanimous adoption, and that reflects, as Anna reminded us, that reflects reality, that this remains an extremely divisive and complex arena of public policy. So what needs to happen now in terms of the denouement to come to a happy ending of this drama? We have a new set of tools, the global compacts, the entry of IOM into the UN system, which is consequential, which for the first time gives the UN system real capacity to assist member states with migration. The creation of the UN Migration Network, which Michelle mentioned, which finally sort of organizes the UN to assist member states with all its multiple capacities, whether in health or urbanization or the coping with the spread of AIDS, to the particular impact on children. Across the UN system, almost every agency has something to contribute on migrants, because migrants are human beings and involved with everything. And then within the Refugee Compact, we have the comprehensive refugee response framework, a platform for dealing with particular situations, and an annual discussion. These tools are valuable, but tools don't build a house by themselves. People have to take them up and use them. Other actors have to join in and insist, as the Vatican has, insist on being part and partners in the effort to deal with migration in a humane way and in a beneficial way. We have to find ways of dealing with the issues that sort of fell between the cracks of the two compacts. Mixed migration. If someone is not a refugee, who has responsibility for protecting them? Country of origin has responsibility for their citizens. Countries of destination have responsibility for people on their territory. There's a responsibility of international solidarity, but how do you locate that responsibility in particular situations, and how do you activate it? The biggest challenge that is really not dealt with in the compacts is climate change. I think it was just too scary for states to come to a conclusion about how to deal with it. So the Migration Compact has some paragraphs mostly on disaster-related displacement, but the prospect of millions, even hundreds of millions of people being displaced as a result of climate change is not dealt with adequately. And finally, I think the issue that was not dealt with is how to deal with the disruptions that migration can cause, particularly unplanned, poorly managed reception, inadequate investment in integration. Migration can really create messes when it is not properly dealt with. We have the tools, we need to use them to answer the big question of how we prevent migration from becoming a continuing political and human crisis. Thank you.